Andy Marso.
Thanks. Thank you. So the key to being able to get organized is to make sure you write a really long introduction for yourself. So you can Now, I don't have a PowerPoint because I knew somebody like Erica would have like a really awesome PowerPoint, so I figured don't even bother. So I'll just go. So everything happens for a reason, right? How many people have heard that here? Right. It's just the worst, right? It's the worst. Well, let me clarify. There's a couple different ways people use that phrase, and one way is clearly worse than others. The worst is when people say everything happens for a reason to somebody else who's going through something difficult, challenging, someone who's grieving. And I get why people do it. I think they mean well. It's kind of one of those things that people say when they don't know what else to say, right? But I don't think it's very helpful. And I also think it's kind of emotionally evasive. Like, I think that in our culture we have this problem with sorrow, with like sharing somebody else's sorrow. We're really good at sharing somebody else's happiness, like celebrating with somebody. And I think we're good at sharing somebody else's anger. You know, like you can see that at some political rallies, not naming any names. But for some reason, when it comes to that emotion of sadness, it's like awkward for us, right? When somebody we love is sad, and we don't necessarily know how to connect with that sadness or engage with it. And so like we want to push them forward into some future time when they're not going to be sad. So we say something like, I know it's tough now, but everything happens for a reason. Which, like I said, it's not very helpful. Because people need time to grieve, like when something terrible happens. That is a very natural, normal part of the human condition. And so I would suggest an alternative. Something else we can say to people when they're in that sort of a situation. We can say, I'm sorry you're going through this. I care about you when you hurt. And if there's anything I can do for you, please let me know. There's a guy named Tim Lawrence who wrote a pretty good essay about this very phenomenon, in which he called, everything happens for a reason, platitudes cloaked in sophistication. And he suggested 8 words as an alternative, which is, I acknowledge your pain, I'm here with you. I like that. It's good. I like mine better, of course. I'm kind of wordy, but he sums it up pretty well in 8 words. So anyway, that's why I don't think you should ever say everything happens for a reason to somebody else who's going through something difficult. There's another way that we kind of use that phrase, and that's when we kind of say it to ourselves. When we're going through something challenging or hard, we can say like, okay, well, this is tough, but everything happens for a reason, which is not quite as insensitive, obviously, but again, I don't think it's super helpful. Because, again, it's meant to be comforting, and it's meant to give you this sort of sense of, this will all make sense someday, but it's kind of fatalistic, right? And it's kind of like a passive mindset in which we're suggesting that our lives are being acted upon by these forces that are outside of our control. And I think for some people, it's a statement of faith, kind of a remix of the old, it's God's will or God's will be done. And to that, I just want to say, like, personally, I believe in God. I also believe in free will. And there's, centuries and centuries of deep theological debate about reconciling those two ideas. So I'm just going to delve really deeply into all of that right now. Just kidding. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that to you guys, I promise. I'm going to tell a personal story that I hope will kind of encapsulate how this sort of played out in my life. So, some of you may know the background of this story. In 2004, I went from, normal college student one day to almost dead the next day to, 3 weeks in a coma, and then 4 months in the hospital and amputations of all, yada, 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 et cetera, But as I was laying there in that hospital bed when I first woke up from that coma, in 2004, there was a lot that I had to kind of make sense of, right? So I woke up, and to me, it was like just the day before I had been fine and then starting to feel a little sick. And I remembered going to the hospital, but I didn't really remember much of anything else. And then suddenly I'm waking up and I got this tube down my throat. I can't move my hands and feet. It was very strange. And so at first, when I kind of became aware of my surroundings, I had all these people coming into my hospital room and telling me, wow, this is what happened. It's a miracle that you survived. This is incredible. And so I was thinking like, well, that's pretty good. You know, must be some reason that I'm still here, because, you know, everything happens for a reason. But I also recognized that something was not quite right with my limbs. And what had happened was this bacterial infection had gotten into my bloodstream. And so that whole 3 weeks that I'd been in a coma, I had lost circulation to my extremities. And my hands and feet were more or less rotting while still attached to my body. So when I woke up, I had to kind of adapt to that somehow. And my life to that point did not prepare me for that challenge. I grew up solidly middle class, 2 loving, supportive parents, not a whole lot of challenges whatsoever. And I didn't like seek out a whole lot of challenges either. And I remember quite clearly, like when me and my brothers would ask my parents when we were little, we would ask like, well, are we rich or are we poor? And my parents would always say the same thing: we're comfortable. We're comfortable. And that's actually a pretty apt description of my childhood up to that point: comfortable. And then suddenly, things were decidedly uncomfortable. And I had to make sense of it. So, you know, when the doctors told me what had happened and said, like, best case scenario here, you're going to lose some of your fingers and toes, I just couldn't really accept that. I just kind of turned my mindset straight to the denial setting and just left it there. And I felt like, this is not going to happen. They're wrong. Rather than facing reality, I kind of daydreamed about some like cosmic twist of fate that was going to, you know, turn my circumstances around, and it was all going to make sense. You know, this thing that I couldn't wrap my brain around would all make sense because everything happens for a reason. So I was telling myself that, and telling myself that there had to be some reason for this other than me spending the rest of my life with mangled limbs. And then I found out that this girl that I had a crush on in high school was going to come and visit me in the hospital. And my brain started concocting this really stupid reason, really stupid, which was that you know, she was going to come and realize that she was in love with me, and then that love was going to magically heal me, and I was going to go back to living my normal life, but now with her, which is really dumb. I mean, and you know, there's being romantic and then there's being totally out of touch with reality, and I blew right past that line. And yeah, so literally none of that happened, of course. You know, she and a mutual friend came and visited, and they left. And when they left, I was still in that hospital bed, and my arms and legs were still mangled. And it was really good that that happened to me early in my hospitalization, because it was a reality check. And it was kind of like, okay, Marso, this is not a fairy tale. This is really happening. And you can't spend, you know, too much of your brain power worrying about why it's happening. You got to figure out what you're going to do about it. How are you going to react to this situation and try and deal with it? And so I took that mindset, that new mindset, and I started to change my approach. I started to, you know, go to my physical therapy sessions in the hospital, even though my feet were mangled and it hurt like hell to try and walk on them. And that mindset, it helped me fight through months of painful treatments in the burn unit at KU. Honestly, like stuff that I didn't even know existed as medical treatment. It was so painful. And it helped me push through the surgeries and ultimately the amputations. that I didn't, want to accept were going to happen, but did happen. And it helped me push through the incredibly dull monotony of a year of physical therapy and occupational therapy, trying to literally get back on my feet and also learn how to feed myself, dress myself, take a shower, go to the bathroom on my own. I was 22 years old and I had to ask my dad for help every time I needed to go to the bathroom. So it was very much like you got to get up every day and tell yourself, okay, what am I going to do today to try and improve this situation a little bit? And I learned to accept that life was not always going to be comfortable. Sometimes it was going to be painful and difficult, and there's going to be no way to avoid that or kind of rationalize it away. You just have to deal with it, essentially. And rather than worrying about why, just accept it, try and figure out how to change it as best you can. So that was part of what spurred me to write a memoir a couple of years after I got out of the hospital. While I was in the hospital, there were several nurses who said, "Oh, you're in journalism, you got to write a book about this." And I was like, yeah, let me figure out how to hold a pen again, and then maybe I'll think about the whole book writing thing. But it definitely planted a seed. And I'd always wanted to write a book anyway. I'd always thought it was cool conceptually. I'd never really felt like it would be cool to actually put in the work to do something like that. But it seemed to be like a fun idea to have written a book. Not so much the writing of the book, but having written the book. So anyway, I knew I had something to write about finally. So I sat down and I started doing the work. I made a conscious decision to start it and finish it, first of all. I wasn't going to just, quit halfway through no matter how hard it got. And part of that was because I just had this experience of, going through this rehabilitation process in which I wasn't allowed to quit, because physically that would have meant essentially going into a nursing home. So I knew I had it in me to essentially finish a big project, something that was going to seem like a slog at times. And so I started it, and I also very consciously made the decision to tell it very honestly and intensely personally, because I felt like that would be the only way to tell the story correctly, to do it right. I told myself, if you're going to do this, you can't sugarcoat this. You have to be honest with all of the stupid thoughts that you had and the stupid things that you did and said. And so it's not always the most flattering portrait of me, but it's honest, and I think that's important. And I got to work, just day after day, typing out what I remembered with what's left of my thumbs here. And as I was writing the book, I found out that there was this really awesome side effect from writing it, which was that it was therapeutic. Since I had been discharged from the hospital, so this was for years, I had been having these nightmares about what happened to me in the hospital. And I realized that I'd suppressed a lot of it in my subconscious mind because I just didn't want to deal with it. And so then it would come up at night in my dreams. And writing about it forced me to bring it into my conscious mind, analyze it, really go over the experience to get to the point where I could actually legitimately accept it. Okay, this happened, and it's okay that it's happened, and now what am I going to do with it, essentially? And so it would have been completely worthwhile even if it was just a project just for me that nobody else ever read. But I was fortunate at the end of 2013 to get it published. And a guy named Doug Thompson, who cuts my dad's hair, happened to read the memoir. And Doug happens to have a pretty dramatic story of his own. About 20 years ago, Doug was kidnapped. A stranger burst into Doug's home one night and took him. He was on the run. He had robbed a liquor store. He'd killed a police officer. He needed a getaway car. He broke into this random house, took my dad's barber, took his car, and drove away. And Doug obviously survived because he was able to read my memoir 20 years later. But so Doug asked me if I would be willing to write about what happened to him that night. And because I had that experience of writing the first book and knowing that I could take on a project like that and finish it, I said, yes, let's do it. And so I spent the next year going through hundreds of pages of court records about what happened that night. I interviewed people like Doug, and the police officer's family is a guy named Officer Brian Kleinfelter. And Officer Kleinfelter's parents are amazing. And getting to know them, just that alone, that relationship, has been one of the great privileges of my entire life. Officer Kleinfelter's parents have managed to publicly forgive the men who killed their son, which I find that somewhat unimaginable. Even to this day, I get obviously choked up about it. But the grace that they showed in that situation, it helped them heal, and it also helped that whole community where I grew up heal from this really traumatic event for the whole town. But when I interviewed them, Brian's mom told me that one thing still bothered her deeply about that night, 20 years later, and that's that she thought her son died alone out on that highway. And then one day, as I'm going through these court records, I find a police interview with a woman named Tiffany, who was 17 years old at the time. Tiffany was driving by, she saw Brian get shot, she turned around, stopped, and stayed there with him. Sorry. She stayed there with him, comforting him while he died. And somehow, despite multiple court trials over several years, Brian's parents had never heard about Tiffany. And so I was able to find Tiffany, and I was able to get her together with Brian's parents. And I was there when they thanked her for the kindness that they showed their son, that she showed their son, on that road that night. And I tell you, as you can tell, it is something I will never forget. It will always be one of the most meaningful things I've ever been part of. And as I was driving home that night, I started to think about all of these unlikely circumstances that led me to that moment that day, that really profound moment that I never would have predicted having in my whole life. And I realized I could draw this straight line from those terrible days, first days in the hospital, to writing the memoir about them, to Doug reading the memoir, to this meeting between Tiffany and Brian's parents who just needed that one last bit of closure. And I remember thinking it was all interrelated, the good, the bad, the tragedy, the triumph, the unforgettable. One would not have been possible without the other. So everything happens for a reason, right? No. I also realized that I made choices all along the way. I chose to get up every day and work at my rehab so that I could get out of the hospital, so that I could get back to my life, so that I could get back to writing. I chose to spill all of my emotions out into that memoir. I chose to keep trying to get that memoir published after about 36 or so rejection letters. I stopped counting after a while. Eventually got that one letter that mattered. I chose to keep going. I chose to say yes when Doug asked me to write that second book, even though I knew essentially what I was getting myself into. I knew it would be a major project. And I chose to request those court records and go through all of them because I knew that if I was going to do this, I had to tell the story right. I needed to know everything I could know about what happened that night. So none of that would have happened if I had sat back passively waiting to find out what this all means. None of it would have happened if I hadn't decided I was going to control the meaning of my own experience with meningitis. And so what I've learned is this. Yes, everything happens for a reason. But we ultimately get to decide what those reasons will be. And that's all.